If you watched my fix video for X-Men The Last Stand, you know I feel one of the biggest mistakes that movie made was trying to do the mutant cure storyline side by side with the Dark Phoenix storyline. For a long time, I thought they should have split that into two movies and just assumed that people would like one enough that you would get an X-Men 4. I don't know if doing a solo Wolverine movie in between Last Stand and Dark Phoenix would fly with audiences, especially since I have a post-credit scene in Last Stand teasing that Jean is definitely coming back. And best case scenario, you get a Wolverine movie the following year, and maybe Dark Phoenix the year after that. But hey, people had to wait 6 years for Thanos to do something once he was teased, so people only having to wait 2 or 3 years and 2 films isn't that bad. And you might be saying, wait a sec, Dark Phoenix the movie didn't come out until 2019, but you're doing a fix for it after X-Men Origins Wolverine, which came out in 2009. Yeah, I am breaking my own rules a little bit, but we did get a Dark Phoenix movie, so it's not like I'm completely inventing a movie. I'm just moving it backward in time a little bit and giving it and the mutant cure storyline a little bit more room to breathe. You may have noticed in my fix video for X-Men The Last Stand that I took some of the ideas and concepts that almost made it into that movie and tried to work them in whenever those ideas lined up with what I was already planning on doing. Not to crap on Brett Ratner too much, though he does deserve it, but I did that because many of those ideas would have made a better movie. But when you get to the Dark Phoenix portion of what people like director Bryan Singer and screenwriter Michael Dougherty wanted to do in X-Men The Last Stand, it's not great. Actually, I take that back. It's not that any of these unused concepts are bad per se, but they do not fit with the tone that had been established in the previous movies. Both Singer and Dougherty talked about treating the Phoenix as a goddess who transcends her humanity and goes out into outer space. I guess sort of like Dr. Manhattan in The Watchmen, or like the Star Child from 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is the comparison both men used when they were talking about what they wanted to do with this movie. But the problem is that these movies had avoided doing some of the more out there stuff like cloning or time travel or giant eternal space goddesses made out of fire. So even if you ditch the space goddess portion of the Phoenix and you say Jean naturally becomes this higher evolved entity that leaves the planet, that is still going in a direction that feels completely different than what had been established in earlier movies. So much as I don't like the idea of Professor X mentally rewriting Jean's personality in The Last Stand, it's made even worse when you rewatch X2 and he's joking about rewriting Logan's personality, I do think Ratner at least was leaning in the right direction in ignoring the cosmic goddess aspect of the Dark Phoenix. If you're going to do that story in this franchise, it needs to be grounded. Not Chris Nolan Batman grounded, but at least on the same level as the other movies we've already seen. So Jean leaving the planet at the end like Singer and Dougherty wanted is off the table. Now you might say that the Marvel Cinematic Universe that we have today makes it look really easy to have something ridiculous like a talking raccoon or a talking tree in their movies, but they still had to build up to that kind of thing. And with this only being the 5th movie in less than a decade, at least in my version where this comes out after X-Men Origins Wolverine, I'm not sure if people would have accepted a demon space goddess just yet. Even when you add in time travel and ancient Egyptian mutants returning to the present day with a vengeance, to me, those things are easier to swallow than the cosmic stuff that is inherent with the Phoenix. So in my fix, while we will go for a more grounded approach here, we'll hopefully avoid the mess that The Last Stand gave us and try to hit up some of what made the Dark Phoenix saga work so well in the comics. I don't hate the opening scene of The Last Stand with the younger versions of Xavier and Magneto talking to young Jean Grey. I know some people complained about the CGI de-aging effects, but when you watch that movie after seeing X-Men Origins Wolverine, it looks downright majestic. And I know once you got into the prequel movies, people started poking holes in this scene, since Eric would have already been Magneto for about 20 years by the time Jean would have been this age. But that's more of a problem of First Class and its sequels than The Last Stand. But even though I do like the idea of Eric and Charles visiting potential students together before they went their separate ways, there wouldn't be much of a reason to have Magneto in this flashback scene. We depowered him at the end of my fix for The Last Stand, and the reason he's in the flashback scene in The Last Stand is to parallel the scene where he and Charles are both trying to talk to Jean in the present day. Without that scene, the flashback scene setting it up loses its weight. So our altered opening scene in 1985 will have Professor Xavier, I don't know if he's in a wheelchair or not at this point, and I guess that's not important, coming to the Grey household. We see that Jean is an emotional wreck, but we don't know why yet. She'll ask him if he can help her, and then we cut to the present day at the school. This is less than half a year after the events of my fix for X-Men The Last Stand, so we're talking mid to late 2001 here, if you like me trying to establish a firm timeline for these fixes. Xavier is talking about transformation and how it is an important part of a mutant's life, but it can also be scary. Is this too heavy-handed? Probably, but I'm keeping it. He'll talk about how he went from being the most powerful telepath on the planet to having no powers to back to being a rudimentary telepath. Maybe he can also throw in some stuff about how a caterpillar doesn't know what's in store for it, but it's still a beautiful thing once it gets there. I don't know, dialogue isn't my strong suit. The point is we're hinting at the Dark Phoenix stuff. Beast is teaching, but he goes on occasional combat missions. He's also working with Forge, studying the cure to see if there's some way that they can reverse it. Cyclops is still teaching, but he is now back on the field team as well. His whole thing in my fix for The Last Stand was that he's gotten over any hangups he had about the dangers of field missions, but he's also grown closer to the students, so I would want him to still keep teaching them as well. Storm is still the field leader, where she and Cyclops kinda stepped on each other's toes a little bit in my fixes for the first movie. I want them to have moved past that by this point. Now they're both comfortable where they are in the team, they work together flawlessly, and if anything ever happened to Storm, Cyclops would go right back into field leading again. Wolverine and Storm are still in a relationship, but it's not a big part of the movie. Archangel is still with the X-Men, but he's also trying to slowly repair his relationship with his dad, who he may mention but we won't see in this movie. Forge is on the field team sometimes, but his big thing he's been working on since The Last Stand is recalibrating Cerebro so it's safe for Xavier to use again. It's been since the beginning of the first movie that it's been safe for anyone to use it without doing damage, so it's high time Forge, our resident inventor, did something about that. Banshee is no longer with the X-Men. While some of the mutants who got cured in The Last Stand are able to bounce back pretty easily, Banshee did not feel like he had a place at the school or with the X-Men in any capacity without his powers, so he's probably rejoined Interpol, or he's assisting Agent Duncan and his team of soldiers in tracking down different cells of the Friends of Humanity and any last remnants of Magneto's Brotherhood. Bobby got hit with the cure, but he's still at the school. Now he's one of the Danger Room supervisors. Rogue is still on the field team and is really coming into her own with her powers. We will see a scene where she is learning to touch someone just long enough to take some of their powers without physically hurting the person. She doesn't have full control, but she is progressing. Her relationship with Bobby is a little rocky, partly because they still have the same obstacles they had before in that they can't touch, but also, with Bobby no longer being on the field team, they aren't able to spend as much time together. And we will have another wrench thrown into the works. Colossus is on the field team now, and he and Rogue are friendly with each other. When he's in his metal form, she can actually touch him. Granted, it's not the same as flesh on flesh, but it's better than not being able to touch at all. We will say he is Russian. I think Daniel Cudmore did a fine job with what little he was given in these movies, and I'm pretty sure the people in charge did not want Colossus to be Russian for some reason. But here, he is. I know a lot of people probably weren't okay with an Iceman-Rogue relationship since it wasn't a thing in the comics. They liked their Gambit-Rogue ship. And they also weren't okay with an Iceman-Kitty Pryde romance because they liked their Colossus-Kitty ship. So I wouldn't be making those happy by teasing at a Rogue Colossus thing. But this was at least teased a tiny bit in the X-Men comics of the late 90s, very early 2000s. I'm not saying Rogue and Colossus would actually end up together, though. That's just there as another obstacle. Colossus would not play a huge part in this movie since we've already got quite a few other characters. He can be about as active here as he was in the Last Stand movie, maybe a little bit more active. Meanwhile, in a back alley somewhere, we will see a couple of people talking, and it's clear one of them is a mutant. He will say something like, "I can't guarantee that this will work," and the other one will say, "It doesn't matter, if there's a chance you need to do it." So the first one uses his powers on the second one, and after a few seconds, almost collapses. We will find out these two were followers of Magneto in The Last Stand. One of them is Fabian Cortez, who has the power to temporarily amplify another mutant's abilities. Cortez has been seeking out mutants who are depowered and is trying to use his abilities to undo the cure. It has worked a couple of times, but it also takes a lot out of Cortez. And since Cortez was never someone to act altruistically, we will say that he is trying to rebuild Magneto's power base to continue what Magneto started in The Last Stand. The problem is that even when he's able to reignite a mutant's lost powers, it isn't enough to build an army off of. At the mansion, Professor X calls in the team to tell them that he got a tip from Banshee that there's been some unusual activity at Alkali Lake. While Banshee didn't have many details, he gathered that many of the civilians in the surrounding small towns near the lake were somewhat alarmed by an influx of outsiders who they thought were military. Banshee knows that they weren't military, but he can't get any information from his sources about who they are. Xavier uses Cerebro to scan the minds of the locals who live in the surrounding towns, and he does see that there were unusually many more visitors in these towns asking about the recent explosion at the dam. When Xavier looked further, he sensed that there had been a powerful mutant within a mile of where Jean died, but when he sought this mutant out, he could not find a trace of him or her. Xavier says this could be nothing, but he suspects someone might be investigating William Stryker's Weapon X facility, and that will not bode well for mutants. After Fabian Cortez gives a boost to his fellow acolyte, they part ways and Cortez sits down to rest, and he is kidnapped. Cortez is confused when he is brought to a building owned by the Hellfire Club, a very large organization that is mostly the rich and elite of humanity. Cortez is greeted by Emma Frost, the chairwoman of the Hellfire Club and CEO of Frost Enterprises. She confides that she is also a mutant. I mentioned this in my video on X-Men The Last Stand, but apparently Bryan Singer wanted to cast Sigourney Weaver as Emma Frost, which I wasn't sure about because I'd say the biggest biggest thing Emma Frost is known for is her alluring body. Please don't get me wrong, I think Sigourney Weaver is a very attractive woman, and she certainly doesn't look like someone who would have been almost 60 when The Last Stand came out. But if you ask me who I would cast to play Emma Frost, she isn't the first actress that comes to mind. But the more I thought about this, the more I liked it, because I'm just going to go out on a limb and say Weaver probably would not have wanted to have dressed like this in the movie. They would have had to play up Emma's conniving personality a lot more, which I do think Weaver can do, as we've seen in The Defenders and what little she was in Cabin in the Woods. So long story short, too late, I like Weaver as Emma Frost even if she doesn't really look the part. Frost explains to Cortez that while most members of the Hellfire Club are baseline humans, there are a select few who run the show who are mutants, and they use the club's vast resources to help the mutants of the club ascend to the top of the world. She will say it a little bit more elegantly than that, but this is effectively the club's goals. When Cortez asks what the club needs with him, Frost will show him Jean Grey, who they rescued/kidnapped in the post-credits scene at the end of my fix for The Last Stand. Emma will feed Cortez some nonsense about how this mutant was depowered and in the process almost died, and they need Cortez's help to re-energize her. Cortez doesn't buy it, and he thinks Frost is hiding something. At this point, we'll see Emma's telepathic powers as she uses them to send Cortez to the ground writhing in pain. Cortez agrees to help, but he tells Frost that this process always takes a lot out of him. Frost will ominously say that he should let her worry about that. One thing I will be taking some liberties with is the motivations for the Hellfire Club. In the Dark Phoenix saga of the comic books, Mastermind is manipulating Jean Grey mostly as a test to see if he is worthy of joining the inner circle of the Hellfire Club, which is fine, but in my fixes for these movies, the Hellfire Club specifically sought Jean out after her alleged death, so we need something more than that. Like in the comics, we will say that the Hellfire Club has been around for hundreds of years, operating mostly behind the scenes, pushing people to do stuff that suits their whims, like trying to get the mutant cure in production in The Last Stand to eliminate any powerful mutants who might stand in their way. But I'd be borrowing something from the Ultimate Comics that some people might not like. There, the Hellfire Club actually built their entire organization on the Phoenix and had worshipped it for centuries, and they believed Jean Grey was the reincarnation of the Phoenix. Like I said, we're not going with Cosmic Space God, but hopefully this can still capture the spirit of the original Dark Phoenix story, with the Hellfire Club pushing Jean beyond her limits, while still keeping things within the realm of the tone of the earlier movies. So Jean Grey almost died at the end of X2, but was able to throw up some kind of telekinetic shield that protected her from the dam exploding. And the Hellfire Club, maybe since they have their own world-class telepath, somehow they sensed that a very powerful mutant had a power spike near the end of the events of X2, and finally found her at the end of The Last Stand. And while I wouldn't want Jean to actually be the embodiment of whatever creature the Hellfire Club has secretly worshipped for all these centuries, I would say that Emma does believe that Jean is the embodiment of this thing. She just needs to be coaxed into reaching her full potential, which is where Fabian Cortez comes in. And while Fabian will be here to amp up Jean's natural psychic and telekinetic abilities, Emma will be doing what Mastermind did in the comics, messing with Jean's mind a little bit to make her more pliable in the hands of the Hellfire Club. In the comics, Mastermind was making Jean experience memories of what she thought was a previous life from the 1700s. Here, Jean is already dazed and confused from her near-death experience, so we will have Emma tell Jean that she is the next step in evolution beyond mutants. But Xavier feared her and wanted to hold her back, so he installed power-dampening blocks in her mind and made sure she never reached her full potential. Jean will think that doesn't sound quite right, but with Emma implanting various memories in her mind and making other real memories hazier, Jean will more or less be susceptible to Emma's manipulations. Meanwhile, the X-Men team gets to Alkali Lake, and Colossus will be able to walk around under the lake without the need of an oxygen tank or anything like that, so he investigates and he won't see any evidence that anyone disturbed the old Weapon X facility. But somehow, he'll be able to report that Jean Grey's body is not where the team said it would be. I know, realistically, the body would have floated away or decayed after a few months, but for the purposes of this video, somehow Colossus can say with certainty that Jean Grey's body is not down there. At the Hellfire Club, when Cortez begins to boost Jean's powers, he will start to wear out, but Emma telepathically forces him to keep going, making Jean much more powerful, which will end up killing Cortez. At the mansion, Professor X senses the most powerful mutant energy signature that he has ever felt before. Jean panics and escapes the Hellfire Club to try and get a handle on her new power boost. Michael Dougherty talked about an idea he had, where Jean would be destroying mutant prisons and cargo ships that were shuttling mutant slave labor. I kinda like those ideas, so you can say that Jean senses a group of the Friends of Humanity in the act of mistreating a mutant or a group of mutants, and she will telekinetically disassemble the wrongdoers. Professor X will contact the X-Men and tell them he just sensed a very powerful mutant. Xavier doesn't know that this is Jean because her powers don't match what Jean was capable of, and her mental patterns aren't that similar to what he knows of Jean either. The X-Men go to Jean's location, they're all shocked, she kinda recognizes them, they see what she's done to the Friends of Humanity, and they try to convince her to come back with them to the mansion, and she gets very angry when they say that they should go there, and she trounces them, but she does not do any permanent damage. She escapes, the X-Men go back to the mansion empty-handed to talk about why this impossible thing has now happened. Professor X says Jean always had hidden depths to her powers that she never fully reached, but he never suspected that she was capable of this. He theorizes that she somehow went into a hibernation state to allow her body to recover and was possibly pulled out of this state too soon. With Jean becoming a sort of god vigilante, the X-Men will try to track her down and stop her before she kills anyone else. Reluctantly, Cyclops asks Beast to bring the sample of the cure that he's been studying. While they all find the idea of using it repugnant, they'd much rather depower her than be forced to try to kill her. So Act 2 of this movie will be the X-Men trying to find Jean to save her from herself, while Emma Frost and the Hellfire Club will try to find her to use her for their own ends. The X-Men will encounter some of Frost's minions, and there will be a fight or two during their search for Jean. While the X-Men keep Frost's Hellfire goons busy, somehow Frost and Xavier will both be able to track Jean down, and we will have a scene like in The Last Stand, where Magneto and Xavier are her shoulder devil and angel respectively. On top of Xavier telling Jean to come home, and Emma telling her to unleash her power, you will have Xavier trying to convince Jean that Emma has been lying to her. But Jean senses Xavier also isn't telling the entire truth. We will get an expansion of the flashback at the beginning of the movie, where we will see that Jean's powers manifested right as she saw her best friend get run over by a car, and she was mentally there with her friend as it happened. This traumatized her, which caused the Greys to bring in Charles. Instead of Charles deciding that Jean is too powerful and needs to be taken down a peg, we will find out Jean asked him to put the psychic blocks in her mind, which dampened her powers. This does two things. One, it gives Jean more agency than what she had in X-Men The Last Stand and in the Dark Phoenix movie. Both movies make Jean a passive character who is reacting to what is done to her. This way, you can say Jean wanted this and even went so far as to beg Charles to remove certain memories from her mind because they haunted her and she didn't think that she could live with that. Charles would have tried to dissuade Jean of this, but she was insistent. Please, this is the only way that I can keep going on. One, it's Jean's choice. Two, this makes Charles less of a villain. He comes off looking especially bad in The Last Stand. He seems so cavalier in his decision to effectively create a brand new personality for Jean because he is so certain that she would have gone down the path of the dark side. Why stop there? Why not remake the entire world in the way that you think everyone should act, Charles? The Dark Phoenix movie kinda softens the blow since he doesn't want a child to find out that her father doesn't want her anymore and that she is responsible for killing her mother. And he's not rewriting her personality, just removing key memories. Though even then, I think there's a better way to handle it than rewriting a child's memories then deciding to never come clean about it. The X-Men will make it to wherever this confrontation is happening, but they arrive too late. Much like in The Last Stand, Jean gets angry and kills Xavier. You will get your big no moment, and Jean and Emma escape while the X-Men mourn the professor. Not to toot my own horn, but since my fix does not have Charles messing with people's brains willy-nilly, his funeral scene will be a little bit more tragic, and isn't something that is effectively caused when he screwed with Jean's mind. After the funeral, nobody is really sure what to do. Should they keep going as X-Men? Even if they decide to continue in honor of the professor's memory, none of them are sure that they can take on Jean after what they've seen that she is capable of. It will be Cyclops who convinces everyone, yes, they do continue. While this dream may have started out with the professor, they all adopted it as their own dream, and now they will continue it because their work is not done. One of them will ask how they're going to stop Jean. We will use the cure, and if that doesn't work, we will do what we have to do to stop her before she goes any further. Wherever Jean and Emma retreated to, Emma will be trying to convince Jean that the X-Men are a threat to her, mostly because Emma doesn't think the X-Men will stop. Jean, even in her dazed state, is pretty shaken up after killing Xavier, so she's not ready to go after people she is beginning to recognize were her friends at one time. Emma will continue trying to manipulate Jean, and somehow she will get caught in one of her lies. Emma starts to show the first signs of fear at what she has unleashed, and she tries to tell Jean it's because of her that Jean was rescued from the bottom of Alkali Lake. Jean calmly says she doesn't need Emma anymore, and she telekinetically disassembles her. Jean will begin destroying the entire Hellfire Club complex, sending various employees and henchmen running. It's not difficult for the X-Men to track down Jean at this point, and Jean will be keeping the team at bay, but it's clear Jean does not mean them any harm, or she would have killed them instantaneously like she did with Xavier. Now, I like Wolverine. I think he's been in some pretty cool stories, but why in the round world was he the one who killed Jean in the climax of The Last Stand? I get it. Apparently James Marsden's schedule was tied up, so they killed Cyclops off screen in the first act of that movie, but Wolverine did not have that much of an emotional connection to Jean, much as these movies tried to convince us otherwise. I'm not even the biggest Cyclops fan, but this moment of showdown against Jean really does belong to him, just like it did in the Dark Phoenix comic book. Cyclops will somehow be able to approach Jean and tell her that this isn't her. He has the cure in his pocket, but he wants to talk to Jean before using it. Jean will somehow try to goad Cyclops into killing her because she realizes that she has crossed the line and killed the man who was like a father to her. Cyclops won't do it, so Jean takes the cure from him and telekinetically injects it into herself. The original Dark Phoenix saga potently ends with the death of Jean, but we won't be doing that here because we already did her tragic heroic sacrifice at the end of X2, and it would feel redundant to hit that story beat again. So instead of killing Jean, after she takes the cure, a big bright light flashes, and the next thing the X-Men know, Jean is not there. She's not dead, there's no body, but she is gone. Maybe Wolverine says that he can find her scent and track her, but Cyclops stops him and says that if she's still out there, she will come to them whenever she's ready. Cyclops has just the slightest glimmer of a smile because Jean left him a message before she disappeared. The cure did not fully take away her powers, but it did greatly reduce what Fabian Cortez did to increase them. Both Bryan Singer and Michael Dougherty said their ideal versions of X3 would have ended with Jean still out there somewhere doing her thing, and that's what I'd want to do here. Jean mentally tells Scott she is going out into the world to try to recollect her thoughts and put herself back together. While she still isn't the person she once was, she has enough control over herself and isn't powerful enough that she knows she isn't a threat anymore. She tells Scott she does love him and she may come back to him someday, but she can't put herself back together at the mansion. She asks Scott to continue doing what the professor did for them when they were kids, and with that, her message ends. It's not perfect, but like I said, killing her a second time, that would be repetitive. And since they did bring Jean back into comics in ways that were at best comical and at worst very convoluted, I think this way, if you did want to bring Jean back in another movie, you've got a pretty good way to do that. At the end of the movie, Rogue and Iceman will hold hands and say, "I love you," because Rogue was touched, metaphorically, by Scott and Jean's love and realizes that being able to touch someone is not the only ingredient to love. And I know it's sappy, but Rogue usually is, so I think it works. We will see Archangel hanging out with his dad, and news reports of some of the corrupt stuff missing Frost Enterprises CEO was into, and Warren's dad will probably become the new chairman of the Hellfire Club. Where Frost's secret facility was, he will set up a mutant youth center for mutant runaways who have nowhere else to go. This will be where the X-Men go to see if these kids want to go to the school, but it's not mandatory. Cyclops will be the new headmaster of the school, while Storm will continue leading the field team. As Cyclops said earlier in the movie, their work is not finished. If you want to be heartwarming / sappy, you can end the movie on Professor Xavier's speech about transformation from the beginning of the movie. And that's all I have for this one. Not a faithful adaptation of the original story, but I think it has enough of the same beats that it would have been a pretty good movie. I do think the X-Men should be more heavily involved, and if I was a real screenwriter, I would definitely give more plot stuff to them over the middle course of the movie, but for a basic structure, I think this one is sufficient. I hope you guys like this, and if you did, be sure to share it with your friends and enemies. And if you did like this, I do other kinds of videos on this channel as well, so check those out while you're waiting for my next fix video. And speaking of the next fix video, it'll be X-Men First Class, so watch this space for that one to appear in the near future. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.